Hey there, folks. Tonight, we're diving into some seriously shady stuff. We're talking about how disasters and crises are used to push through policies that benefit the wealthy few at the expense of everyone else. It's messed up, it's happening right under our noses, and it's time we all knew about it. This isn't some crazy conspiracy theory. We're talking about the Shock Doctrine, a groundbreaking book by journalist Naomi Klein. In it, she exposes how governments and corporations exploit moments of collective shock and disorientation to ram through unpopular economic policies. Think about it. After a natural disaster, a war, or even a financial meltdown, people are scared, confused, and desperate for answers. They're looking for someone to tell them what to do, how to rebuild, how to survive. And that's when the disaster capitalists swoop in. They offer quick fixes and easy solutions, but there's a catch. These solutions just happen to involve things like deregulation, privatization, and cuts to social programs. Policies that benefit the rich and powerful while leaving everyone else out to dry. So, who is this Naomi Klein, and why should we listen to her? Well, she's kind of a big deal. Klein is an award-winning journalist, author, and filmmaker who's been called the most visible and influential figure on the American left. She's been writing about corporate greed, social injustice, and the climate crisis for decades. Her work has been translated into over 30 languages and has inspired countless people to stand up and fight back against the powers that be. Klein doesn't just sit in an ivory tower, though. She's a boots-on-the-ground reporter who's traveled the world, witnessing firsthand the devastating impacts of these shock doctrine policies. From the ruins of post-invasion Iraq to the streets of hurricane-ravaged New Orleans, she's seen the human cost of disaster capitalism. And let me tell you, folks, it ain't pretty. Now, let's talk about this term, disaster capitalism. It sounds like something out of a dystopian novel, right? But unfortunately, it's all too real. Disaster capitalism is the practice of exploiting crises to advance corporate interests. It's about taking advantage of people's fear and vulnerability to push through policies that would never fly in normal times. Think about it like this. Imagine your house burns down. You're devastated, you've lost everything, and you don't know where to turn. Then some slick dude in a suit shows up and says, "Hey, I can rebuild your house for you, no problem. Just sign this contract." You're desperate, so you sign it without reading the fine print. But later, you realize you've agreed to pay an exorbitant amount of money for a shoddily built house. That, my friends, is disaster capitalism in a nutshell. One of the most chilling examples of the shock doctrine in action is what happened in Chile in the 1970s. In 1973, a US-backed military coup led by General Augusto Pinochet overthrew the democratically elected government of Salvador Allende.
Now, Pinochet was a brutal dictator who tortured and murdered thousands of his own citizens. But he was also a free market zealot who saw the coup as an opportunity to remake Chile's economy in the image of his neoliberal idols, Milton Friedman and the Chicago Boys. With the country still reeling from the coup, Pinochet implemented a series of radical economic reforms. These included privatization of state-owned industries, deregulation of the financial sector, and cuts to social programs. These policies were deeply unpopular with the Chilean people, but Pinochet didn't care. He used the shock and terror of the coup to silence dissent and push through his agenda.
Section 5. The Iraq War, a textbook case of shock therapy.
Fast forward a few decades, and we see the shock doctrine being deployed again, this time in Iraq.
In 2003, the United States invaded Iraq, plunging the country into chaos and violence.
Now, I'm not going to get into the whole debate about the Iraq War here.
But what's clear is that the Bush administration used the chaos of the invasion and occupation to push through a radical free market agenda.
They privatized state-owned industries, opened up the country to foreign investment, and implemented flat taxes that disproportionately benefited the wealthy.
These policies were implemented with little to no input from the Iraqi people and had devastating consequences for the country. Section 6, devastating consequences, poverty, inequality, and resistance. So, what happens when these shock doctrine policies are put into practice? Well, the results are pretty predictable. Poverty skyrockets, inequality explodes, and public services crumble.
In Chile, Pinochet's policies led to a dramatic increase in poverty and inequality. The gap between the rich and the poor widened, and the middle class was hollowed out.
In Iraq, the privatization of state-owned industries led to mass unemployment and a decline in living standards for many Iraqis. The country's infrastructure was decimated by the war, and corruption flourished in the absence of effective government oversight.
But it's not all doom and gloom. People are fighting back against these policies all over the world. From the streets of Santiago to the squares of Baghdad, people are rising up to demand social justice and economic equality.
Section 7. The global financial crisis, a missed opportunity. Now, some might argue that the 2008 financial crisis was a golden opportunity to implement some of these shock doctrine policies. After all, the world was in a state of panic and people were looking for solutions.
And sure enough, there were plenty of disaster capitalists waiting in the wings, eager to exploit the crisis for their own gain. But something interesting happened. People were fed up. They were tired of bailing out the banks while their own lives were falling apart. They took to the streets, occupied Wall Street, and demanded change.
The result? The shock doctrine didn't quite work out as planned. While some austerity measures were implemented, there was also a push for greater regulation of the financial industry and increased social spending. Section 8, the shock doctrine today, still relevant, still dangerous. So where do we stand today? Well, the shock doctrine is still alive and well. From the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina to the Greek debt crisis, we continue to see attempts to exploit crises to push through unpopular policies.
The COVID-19 pandemic, for example, provided fertile ground for disaster capitalists. With governments around the world scrambling to respond to the crisis, corporations saw an opportunity to grab more power and profits. We saw attempts to weaken environmental regulations, erode labor protections, and privatize public services, all in the name of economic recovery.
The fight against the shock doctrine is far from over, but the good news is that people are waking up to these tactics. They're realizing that crises are often manufactured or exploited to benefit the few at the expense of the many. Section 9 conclusion, wake up and resist. So what can we do about it? Well, the first step is awareness. We need to educate ourselves and others about the shock doctrine and how it works. We need to be vigilant, to question the motives of those in power, and to resist attempts to exploit crises for private gain. We need to demand transparency, accountability, and democratic participation in decision-making. The shock doctrine thrives on fear, confusion, and apathy, but it can be defeated by courage, solidarity, and a commitment to social justice. So, let's wake up, folks. Let's get informed. And let's fight back against this insidious form of capitalism. Because the only shock we need is the one that wakes us up to the reality of what's happening around us. That's our show for tonight. Stay informed, stay engaged, and most importantly, stay angry.